You are cold, not the comfortable cool of an air-conditioned room. The cold of a stone floor through a thin layer of straw. The cold of a building that has no insulation and no glass in the windows and no mechanism for retaining the heat that the bodies inside it generate, except the bodies themselves, pressed together in the dark. It is somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, by the reckoning of a world that measures time by church bells and the movement of the sun. You do not have a clock. Nobody in your village has a clock. The nearest clock is in the church tower at the edge of the village, and it does not have a face, it only strikes, marking the canonical hours with a sound that carries across the fields on still mornings. Right now, it is silent. The night has hours to go. The year is 1347. The place is a village in the Languedoc region of southern France, a cluster of perhaps 30 or 40 stone and timber buildings arranged along a single muddy track, surrounded by fields that are, at this time of year, late autumn, mostly bare and brown and waiting for spring. The village has a name, though it appears in no historical record that will survive to the present day. It has a church, a mill, a blacksmith, a tavern of sorts, and a lord whose manor house sits on a slight rise at the edge of the village, close enough to watch everything and far enough to make clear that he is not quite part of it. You are listening to Histomnia. If this kind of story helps you rest, consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? We love knowing who is with us in the quiet hours. And if there is a topic you would like to hear next, leave it below. You are a peasant, not a serf in the strictest legal sense. Serfdom in France has been declining for a century, and in the Languedoc, it has never been as rigid as in the north. You are a villain, a free person in the technical meaning of the word, which is to say, you are free to leave your land, free to marry without your lord's permission, free to own property and take disputes to the royal courts. What you are not free from is the obligation to work. The land you farm is not yours. It belongs to the Lord, as almost all land belongs to someone above you in the hierarchy that organizes the medieval world from God at the top to the worms in the soil at the bottom. You hold it in exchange for rent, paid partly in money when you have money and partly in labor. The days you owe the Lord each week, working his fields before you work your own. This arrangement has a name, the Corvée, and it has been the foundation of agricultural life in France for longer than anyone can remember. Back into the dim period of the early medieval centuries, when the system that would eventually be called feudalism was still assembling itself out of the wreckage of Rome. The house you are sleeping in is not large. It is a single room, roughly 6 meters by 4, with walls of rough-cut stone, mortared with clay, and a roof of thatch that lets in light through its gaps in the daytime and cold through those same gaps at night. The floor is earthen, packed hard by years of feet, covered in a layer of straw that is replaced periodically when it becomes too dirty to bear. There is no ceiling. The interior of the roof is exposed, the smoke from the fire rising through the thatch rather than through a chimney, which means the upper part of the room is perpetually grey, with a thin haze that deposits a film of soot on everything including you. The smell is layered and comprehensive. Wood smoke, animal, damp stone, unwashed bodies. The particular smell of straw that has been slept on and generally lived on. You do not notice this smell. You have never not been in it. There are 7 people in this room. You, your wife, your 3 children. The oldest is 12, old enough to work, and the younger 2 are 8 and 5, and your wife's mother, who is perhaps 50 years old, and who moves slowly in the mornings now, but who knows more about the land and the seasons and the management of a household than anyone else in the family. And then there are the animals. 2 goats and a pig share the space with the humans, not out of affection, but out of practical necessity. Their body heat contributes meaningfully to the warmth of the room in winter, and their safety is too important to risk by leaving them outside where the wolves and the foxes and the occasional desperate neighbor might get to them. The pig in particular is the most valuable thing your family owns. Its slaughter in November, preserved in salt, will provide meat through the months when the fields produce nothing. This is not the Middle Ages of popular imagination. It is not the Middle Ages of illuminated manuscripts and soaring cathedrals and chivalric tournaments, though all of those things exist somewhere in your world. As remote from your daily experience as the surface of the moon, it is the Middle Ages of the vast majority of medieval people, the ones who made none of the objects that fill museums and wrote none of the texts that fill libraries, and whose lives were recorded only incidentally. In the account books of monasteries and the tax records of lords, and the occasional court document when something went seriously wrong. They are the foundation on which everything else was built. These people sleeping in their smoky rooms with their goats and their straw, and they are almost entirely invisible to history. Outside, the village is quiet. The kind of quiet that is genuinely quiet, that has no traffic, no electrical hum, no distant aircraft, no ambient noise of civilization going about its business. The medieval night is dark in a way that modern people rarely experience. Truly dark. The kind of dark in which you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The kind that makes the stars, when they appear, seem almost offensive in their brightness. The only light is the low red glow of the banked fire in the center of the room, giving just enough illumination to make out the shapes of sleeping bodies. The dog is awake. There is always a dog in a village house, and this one is a medium-sized brown animal of no particular breed who sleeps at the door and whose primary function is to bark at anything that approaches in the dark. He is sitting up now, ears forward, listening to something outside that you cannot hear. You watch him for a moment. He relaxes. A fox probably, or a neighbor returning late from somewhere. Not a wolf. The dog would be significantly more agitated. You have learned to read the dog the way you read the weather, as one of the instruments available for understanding the state of the world around you. Your wife is awake too, or partially awake, in the way that people sleep when they have young children and a household to run. Never fully asleep, always listening with some part of the mind for the sounds that require attention. She will be up before you, as she is every morning, to rebuild the fire before the cold of the room becomes impossible. Her day is longer than yours, and harder in ways that are less visible. The perpetual management of the household, the cooking and the spinning, and the care of the children and the animals, and the 100 small tasks that keep a family alive, tasks that are not counted as work in any of the records that survive, but that are the actual substance of daily life. Close your eyes if you like. Let the sounds of the world around you grow quiet. Tonight we are going to spend one full day in this world, from this cold pre-dawn darkness through the long hours of field labor and the brief pause of the midday meal and the return home at dusk, through the evening tasks and the darkness and the thin sleep that is all this life allows. We will look at what the science of medieval history, archaeology, demography, agricultural history, the study of court records and tax documents, and the occasional peasant voice that somehow made it into the written record, can tell us about how these people actually lived. We will look at what they ate and how they cooked it, what they believed and how deeply they believed it, how the feudal system worked from the inside rather than the outside, how they thought about time and death and the body and God and the Lord and each other. And we will watch as the day unfolds for something that is moving toward this village from the south, something that has already reached Marseille, that is working its way north through the towns and the roads of France, that will arrive here, in this village, in this room, within months. Something that has no name yet in this village, though it will have many names before it is done. But that is later. For now, the fire is low, the dog has settled, and the night is almost over. The bells will ring for prime, the first canonical hour, the hour of first light, in perhaps 2 hours. Until then, there is only this: the dark, the cold, the sound of 7 people and 2 goats and a pig breathing in the same room, and the particular quality of the medieval night that has been pressing against the walls of this house for as long as anyone can remember, and will press against them long after everyone inside it is gone. The bell rings for prime at the first grey light of dawn, and by the time it finishes striking, you are already outside. Not because the bell woke you, you were awake before it, as you almost always are. The body having learned over years of this life to anticipate the bell the way it anticipates hunger, as a physical fact that precedes conscious awareness. Your wife is at the fire, blowing the coals back to life, the smoke rising through the thatch in a thin grey column that joins the thin grey columns rising from every other house in the village. The children are still sleeping. You will let them sleep another hour. The oldest will be in the fields with you by mid-morning, but the younger two are too small yet for the heavy work, and sleep is the one thing this life provides in abundance. The air outside is cold and smells of rain and turned earth, and the particular smell of a medieval village in the morning, which is to say it smells of animals and dung and wood smoke, and the accumulated organic matter of a community that has been living in the same place for generations without any mechanism for disposing of waste except time and weather and the absorption capacity of the soil. The street, if it can be called a street, this muddy track between the houses, is churned and soft underfoot. It rained in the night. It has been raining on and off for 3 weeks. The fields are heavy and difficult to work, which matters because the work must be done regardless of the conditions, because the calendar of the agricultural year does not accommodate the weather's preferences. You are heading to the Lord's fields first. This is not a choice. The corvée, the labor obligation that defines your relationship with the land and with the man who owns it, requires 2 days of work on the demesne, the Lord's home farm, before you can work your own strips. In the weeks around the autumn harvest and the autumn ploughing, the corvée increases. There are weeks in September and October when you owe the Lord 4 days out of 7, which means you have 3 days to work the land that feeds your family. 3 days to do what the Lord has 6 days of your labor to do for him. The mathematics of this arrangement are not complicated, and everyone understands them clearly, and the understanding changes nothing. The demesne fields are perhaps a kilometre from the village, on the better drained land to the south, where the soil is heavier and richer. You walk there in the early grey light with 4 other men from the village, nobody talking much, the sound of boots on muddy track, and the occasional sound of someone coughing. There is always someone coughing in the autumn, when the cold gets into the chest, and the distant sound of the church bell fading into the morning. The field you are working today is perhaps 3 hectares, a long narrow strip of turned earth that has already been ploughed once and needs to be ploughed again before it can be sown with winter wheat. The plough is a heavy wheeled moldboard plough, iron tipped, pulled by 2 oxen that belong to the Lord and that are in considerably better condition than you are. Oxen are expensive, representing a capital investment that must be maintained, while peasant labor is a renewable resource that maintains itself. The man who handles the oxen, a large, slow-spoken villager named Guichard, who has been doing this particular job since his father did it before him. positions the animals at the far end of the strip and begins. Plowing heavy, wet autumn soil is among the most physically demanding work that human beings do with hand tools. The plow cuts a furrow, perhaps 20 centimeters deep, turning the soil over in a continuous wave, and the person guiding it must keep it straight, keep it at the right depth, keep the oxen moving at a steady pace, and navigate the heavy clay soil that wants to clog the blade and the wet ground that wants to suck the wheels sideways. When the plow sticks, and in wet weather it sticks regularly, it must be cleared by hand, which means reaching into cold mud to remove whatever root or stone has jammed the blade. By mid-morning your hands are numb and filthy and bleeding in 2 places where the metal has caught skin. The strips of the open field system, the way that arable land was organized in medieval France and across most of medieval Europe, are narrow and long, shaped by the difficulty of turning the heavy-wheeled plow. Turning the plow and oxen takes space and time, so the strips are made as long as possible to reduce the number of turns required, and as narrow as possible to allow many different families to hold strips in the same field. Your family holds 4 strips in this field, each perhaps 10 meters wide and 200 meters long, plus strips in 2 other fields that are lying fallow this year under the 3-field rotation system that allows the soil to recover. The total comes to perhaps 3 hectares of arable land, which is roughly what a family needs to survive in a decent year. Roughly what they need to produce enough grain to eat, pay the rent, pay the tithe, and have a small reserve against a bad harvest. A bad harvest in this world is not an inconvenience. A bad harvest means hunger. A very bad harvest, 2 years running, means starvation. Actual starvation. The kind that kills children first and the elderly second, and leaves the adults weakened and vulnerable to the diseases that follow famine, the way shadow follows light. The memory of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is not ancient history here. Your grandfather survived it. He talks about it rarely, and when he does, the talk is brief and specific. The price of bread, the number of people who left the village and never came back, the spring when they ate the seed grain and knew what that meant, the knowledge that this can happen, that the line between sufficiency and catastrophe is thin and unreliable, shapes everything about how you think about the land and the harvest and the obligation to work it properly, regardless of the weather or your body's preferences. By midday, you have plowed perhaps 1/3 of the field. The oxen are rested and watered, and the men sit on the edge of the furrows and eat. Your meal is bread, a thick dark loaf of maslin bread, wheat mixed with rye, because pure wheat is expensive and rye is hardier and cheaper, dense and slightly sour, and filling in the way that food made mostly of carbohydrates is filling, and a piece of hard cheese and a few raw onions from the garden plot behind the house. There is a skin of watered wine, thin and sour, enough to take the edge off the water which comes from the village well, and which is not entirely trustworthy in the autumn when the rains have been running through the livestock yards. You eat quickly and without much conversation. Hunger and cold make conversation optional. The afternoon is harder than the morning. The body has used its reserves of energy and warmth, and the cold has worked deeper into the muscles, and the field seems longer than it did at dawn, the far end receding as you approach it in the way that distances behave when the body is tired. Guichard keeps the oxen moving at the same steady pace he has maintained since dawn. The animals indifferent to fatigue in the way that animals are indifferent to most things that bother humans. The furrows accumulate. The turned earth darkens as the afternoon light fails. There is a particular quality to this kind of physical labor that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Not the acute pain of injury or the sharp exhaustion of a sprint, but the deep, accumulated, whole-body tiredness of hours of sustained effort in cold and wet, the kind that settles into the joints and the lower back and the hands, and that does not go away with an hour's rest, but requires sleep, real sleep, the deep unconscious repair that the body performs on itself in the night. You have felt this tiredness every day of your adult life. You will feel it every day for the rest of your life, which will be shorter than a modern person's life by perhaps 20 years, partly because of disease and partly because of this, the simple mechanical wearing down of a body that works too hard for too long, with too little rest and too little food. The bell rings for vespers, the evening canonical hour, the hour of sunset, and the day's corvée is done. You unhitch the oxen and lead them back to the Lord's stable, a better building than your own house, and then you walk home through the darkening village with the others. Nobody talking, everybody moving with the particular gait of people who are very tired and very close to shelter. Tomorrow, you will do the same thing. But tomorrow, the field is yours. The morning after the Corvée days belongs to your own strips, but first, there is the village to move through. This is unavoidable. The village is small enough that moving through it means passing everyone, exchanging the minimal acknowledgements that constitute social life in a community where everyone has known everyone else since birth and will know them until death, where the distance between any two houses is measured in steps rather than blocks, and where privacy is a concept that exists mainly in theory. You know what your neighbor ate for supper last night, not because anyone told you, but because you could smell it. You know when the miller's wife is unwell because her fire was not lit at the usual hour. You know things about the people around you that you have never been told and would never think to mention, because they are simply part of the texture of living in a place this small for this long. The village has perhaps 200 people, In the context of medieval France, this makes it a medium-sized village, larger than the hamlets of 10 or 20 households that dot the landscape, smaller than the bourgs of 500 or 1,000 that cluster around markets and crossroads. It has existed in roughly its current form for at least 200 years, possibly longer, the stone buildings replacing earlier timber ones on the same foundations, the fields around it shaped by the same patterns of use that shaped them when your great-grandparents were young. It will exist, in some form, for several hundred years more, though by then the population will be different, the buildings different, the names on the graves different, and something that happened in Marseille in the autumn of 1347 will have left its mark on the village in ways that are not yet imaginable. The center of the village, such as it is the church. Not the market. The nearest proper market is a day's walk away, in a town large enough to have merchants and a square and a schedule. But the church, which serves as the organizing principle of time and space and meaning for everyone in the village. The church bell marks the hours. The church calendar marks the year, dividing it into feasts and fasts and ordinary time, into the agricultural seasons that are also the liturgical seasons, so that ploughing and Lent and harvest and the Assumption and the slaughter of the pig and Advent are all part of the same integrated system in which the religious and the practical are not separate categories but aspects of a single continuous reality. When you say that something happened before the feast of Saint Martin or after Easter, you are not using a religious reference as a mnemonic. You are using the only calendar you have, the one that structures your entire experience of time. The priest is a man named Father Bertrand, perhaps 40 years old, who has served this parish for 15 years and who is, by the standards of the rural clergy of the period, neither unusually corrupt nor unusually holy. He knows his parishioners, their sins, their disputes, their debts, their illnesses, their deaths, with the intimate knowledge of a man who has heard their confessions for a decade and a half, and who has baptized their children and buried their parents. He says Mass every Sunday in Latin that almost no one in the congregation understands. This is not a problem, or not experienced as one. The Mass is not a lecture or a lesson. It is a ritual, a performance of sacred action whose efficacy does not depend on comprehension, whose power is in the doing rather than the understanding. You stand or kneel at the appropriate times. You hear the bell that signals the consecration. You receive the host once a year at Easter. The wine is reserved for the priest, and you trust that the transaction between humanity and God that the Mass enacts is proceeding as it should, managed by someone who has been trained for the purpose. The mill is the most important secular building in the village, and the miller is the most important secular functionary, and also the most distrusted. The Lord owns the mill, as he owns the oven and the winepress, and the peasants are required by law to use these facilities and to pay for their use, a requirement known as the bannerlets that generates a steady income for the lord and a steady source of grievance for everyone else. The miller takes his cut of the grain you bring to be ground, a percentage that is fixed by custom, but that custom has a way of expanding when the miller thinks he can get away with it. There are more proverbs about dishonest millers in medieval French than about almost any other profession, which tells you something about how the peasantry experienced the relationship. The current miller, a heavy-set man named Thomas, whose father was the miller before him, is not liked, but he is accepted, because the alternative to using the mill is grinding grain by hand on a quernstone, which is legal only if you own the quernstone outright, and which produces flour of inferior quality at a rate that would occupy most of your waking hours. The blacksmith matters in a different way. Iron is not cheap and not easily replaced, and the plowshares and the hoes and the scythes and the axes that make agricultural life possible need to be maintained and occasionally made, and the blacksmith is the person who does this. The relationship between a village and its blacksmith is one of the more functional relationships in medieval rural life. The smith needs the food that the peasants grow. The peasants need the tools that the smith makes, and the exchange is direct and comprehensible in a way that the relationship with the lord and the miller is not. The current smith is a young man named Arnaud, who took over the forge 2 years ago when his father died, and who is still learning in some respects, but whose work is adequate and whose prices are fair enough that nobody has yet made the 2-day journey to have work done elsewhere. There are other relationships that organize the village in ways less visible than the mill and the church and the forge. The relationships between neighbors who share the management of the open fields, who must coordinate the plowing and the harvest and the fallowing and the grazing rights on the common land in ways that require constant negotiation and occasional dispute. The relationships between families connected by marriage and by debt, the small loans and favors and obligations that accumulate over years and that are never entirely settled and never entirely forgotten. The relationship between the village as a collective entity and the Lord, mediated through the village assembly, the communaux, which meets periodically to make decisions about the commons and the fields and the maintenance of the roads and the bridges, and which has more autonomy than the theory of feudalism would suggest. The Lord's rights being real, but bounded by custom, in ways that even the Lord generally respects, because the alternative is a village full of people who are too resentful to work well. The Lord himself, his name is Gautier de Montbrun, a minor nobleman whose family has held this land for 4 generations, is not a monster. He is not particularly kind either. He is a man with obligations of his own, to the count above him, and to the king above the count. a man whose income depends on the productivity of his peasants, and who therefore has a practical interest in not destroying that productivity, who understands that a village of starving people produces less than a village of fed people. He visits the Demesne fields occasionally, riding through on a horse that costs more than everything your family owns, accompanied by a steward who keeps the records and enforces the obligations. He does not know your name. You are not sure he knows you exist as an individual, as opposed to a category, one of the villains of the village, a unit of agricultural production, a source of labor and rent. This is not a complaint, exactly. It is simply the shape of the world. The widow at the end of the village knows herbs. This is an important fact, more important than it might sound. The nearest physician is in the nearest town, which is a day's walk away, and his services cost money and operate within a theoretical framework. The humoral theory of disease derived from Galen and filtered through Arabic medicine and retransmitted to medieval Europe through the schools of Salerno and Paris, that bears no useful relationship to the actual treatment of the actual diseases that the actual people of this village actually get. The widow's knowledge is different. It is empirical in the purest sense, accumulated over a lifetime of observing which plants in which preparations do what to which conditions, transmitted from older women and tested on sick people and refined through repetition. Some of it works, in the sense that it produces measurable relief of symptoms. Some of it does not work, but does no harm. A small portion of it is actively harmful. The difficulty is that nobody knows which portion is which, including the widow. You pass her house on your way to the fields. She is outside, sorting through a bundle of dried plants, with the focused attention of someone who takes her work seriously. She looks up and nods. You nod back. This is the extent of most social interaction in the village. The acknowledgement, the nod, the brief word. The information exchanged in passing that constitutes the continuous low-level communication of a community that knows too much about itself to need extensive verbal elaboration. You know what she knows, and she knows what you know, and the nod contains all of it. The road through the village connects, at its southern end, to a larger road that leads eventually to the town, and through the town to Marseille, and through Marseille to the sea, and through the sea to places that exist for you as names rather than realities. Italy, where the Pope lives, the Holy Land, where Christ walked, the great cities of the Mediterranean world, whose trade routes carry spices and silk and ideas and occasionally other things. The road is a connection to a world that you will never see, and that will occasionally see you, in the form of traveling merchants and pilgrims and royal tax collectors, and the periodic passage of soldiers moving between somewhere and somewhere else. It is also, though you do not know this yet, the route along which something is currently moving north from Marseille. stopping at each village it passes through, leaving something behind. But the road is quiet this morning. The village is going about its business. The fields are waiting. You eat twice a day. This is not a deprivation. It is simply the rhythm of life in a world where food is produced by hand from the ground, and where the production of food occupies most of the available daylight hours of most of the available people. The idea of 3 meals a day is a later development associated with the urban middle classes of a more prosperous era. People with the time and resources to interrupt their day at midpoint for something more substantial than bread eaten standing in a field. You have no such luxury. There is the morning meal, eaten before work or taken to the field, and consumed during the brief pause at mid-morning. And there is the evening meal, eaten after the day's work is done by the light of the fire. And between these two there is work and more work, and the particular grinding background hunger that is simply the condition of a body that expends more energy than it reliably takes in. The foundation of everything you eat is bread. Not bread as a modern person understands bread. Not the soft white loaf that exists because grain has been refined to remove the bran and the germ, and most of the nutritional content, in exchange for a texture that requires no effort to chew. Your bread is dark and dense and heavy, made from maslin flour, a mixture of wheat and rye, ground together at the mill, still containing most of the grain, leavened with a sourdough starter that has been maintained in your household for as long as anyone can remember, baked in the communal oven that the village shares, and that is heated once or twice a week, and that everyone uses in a rotation governed by custom so old that it no longer requires negotiation. The bread is substantial and filling and slightly sour, and keeps for several days without becoming inedible, which is a practical virtue of the first importance in a household that cannot bake every day. You eat a great deal of this bread. In a normal day, you might consume perhaps 1 kilogram of it, the dense, heavy loaves providing the bulk of your caloric intake, supplemented by whatever else the season and the household resources make available. In the hungry months of late winter and early spring, when the stored grain is running low and the new crops have not yet come in, the bread might be stretched with other flours, dried peas ground to a powder, chestnuts if you have them, acorns in the worst years. Ingredients that produce a bread darker and coarser than usual, and that the body processes with a certain difficulty that makes itself felt in the gut. You have eaten bread that tasted of little except the effort required to make it. You have been grateful for it. The pottage is the other constant. A thick soup or stew. The word pottage covers everything from a thin broth to something almost solid enough to slice, cooked in the iron pot that hangs over the fire and that is never entirely empty. The contents replenished daily with whatever is available. In late autumn, when the garden has been harvested and the stores are relatively full. The pottage contains onions and leeks and cabbage and turnips and dried beans and perhaps a small piece of salt pork for flavouring. The pig that was slaughtered in November, contributing its less noble parts to the pot over the weeks that follow. In spring, it contains the first green things that come up, the wild plants that your wife and your wife's mother know how to find and identify, nettles and chickweed and sorrel, and various things that grow at the edges of fields and that contribute minerals and vitamins to a diet that would otherwise be seriously deficient in both. In summer, it contains whatever the garden is producing. In the worst weeks of winter, it contains mainly root vegetables and dried legumes, and the increasingly faint flavour of a piece of salt pork that has been in the pot for too long. You almost never eat meat. This is the fact about medieval peasant diet that surprises people most consistently, and it is worth dwelling on. The image of the medieval feast, the roasted oxen and the suckling pigs and the haunches of venison, is not wrong, but it describes the diet of perhaps 5% of the population. The nobility and the wealthy clergy and the urban rich, people for whom meat was a daily presence and a marker of status. For you, meat means the pig slaughtered in November and salted and consumed in small quantities over the following months, the occasional chicken too old to lay eggs, the rabbit caught in a snare at the edge of the field. Game is theoretically available. The forest is full of deer and boar, but the forest and everything in it belongs to the Lord, and the penalties for poaching are severe enough to make the risk generally not worth taking. You eat meat perhaps once or twice a week in winter when the salt pork supply holds, and much less than that in the other seasons. The beans and peas and lentils are what the meat is not available to be. Legumes, dried and stored, endlessly versatile, capable of being cooked into the pottage, or ground into flour, or eaten simply boiled with salt, are the primary source of protein in your diet, and you eat them in substantial quantities, and you understand their importance in the way that you understand the importance of the bread as a foundation, a given, something that the diet fails without. The garden behind the house is planted heavily with legumes every year, the rows of beans and peas taking up as much space as the kitchen vegetables, and the harvest of dried legumes in the autumn is treated with the same seriousness as the grain harvest, stored carefully in the dry space under the eaves, measured and rationed through the winter with the attention that any finite and necessary resource demands. There is dairy. The 2 goats that share your house provide milk in quantities that are modest but meaningful, enough for the children to drink some, enough to make a small amount of soft cheese that is consumed quickly because you have no reliable way to preserve it, enough to add to the pottage occasionally and improve its nutritional content in ways that you understand practically, if not theoretically. The milk is seasonal, available in larger quantities in spring and summer when the goats are grazing on good pasture, and declining in winter when the pasture is poor. There are no cows. A cow requires more feed and more land than a family of your resources can manage. And the draft oxen that the Lord owns are not milked. What the goats provide is what you have, and it is enough to make a difference. The garden also produces herbs and onions and garlic and various root vegetables, and these provide the flavoring and some of the nutrition that makes the basic diet of bread and pottage and legumes something more than mere fuel. Your wife tends the garden with a knowledge and a care that goes beyond the practical. The garden is her domain in a way that the fields are not. The space where her expertise and her labor produce results directly under her control, where she makes decisions about what to plant and where and when, without reference to the Corvée or the open field rotation or the Lord's schedule. The garden is small, perhaps 1/10 of a hectare, but in the hands of someone who knows what she is doing, it produces a remarkable variety and quantity of food across a long season. You do not drink water if you can avoid it. The well water is not safe, or rather, its safety varies in ways that are unpredictable and that have caused enough illness over the years that the village has developed a general preference for anything fermented, whose alcohol content, even at low levels, provides a degree of microbial protection that the water does not. The drink of daily life is small ale or thin wine, depending on the region and the season. In the Languedoc, where grapes grow, it is thin wine, watered down to something perhaps 3 or 4% alcohol, a beverage closer to what a modern person might call a very weak wine spritzer than to anything recognizable as wine. Your children drink it from infancy. The nutritional contribution of the grain or grape that went into making it, the B vitamins and the calories, is not nothing. The effect on a small body of consuming mild alcohol throughout the day is also not nothing, though it is not something that anyone has the framework to consider. The cooking is your wife's work, as it is all women's work, as defined by a division of labor so old and so completely assumed that it does not feel like a choice or a policy, but like a fact of nature. She wakes early to rebuild the fire and heat the pottage and cut the bread. She manages the stores, the grain in its sacks, the dried legumes in their containers, the salt pork hanging from the rafter, the root vegetables in their pit, with an accountant's attention to what is available and what will be needed and when. She makes decisions every day about how much to use and how much to save that have direct consequences for whether the family is adequately fed in March, which is the hardest month, when the stores are lowest and the new growth has not yet come. These decisions are made without ledgers or calculators by a woman who cannot read, using the arithmetic of a mind trained by years of necessity to track quantities and rates of consumption with a precision that the situation requires, and that leaves no margin for error. The evening meal is the better of the two. The fire is high, the pottage has been cooking all day and is at its best. There is bread, and there is the thin wine, and sometimes there is something extra. A few dried figs traded for at the last market day, a piece of hard cheese, an egg from the chicken that has been laying again after the summer interruption. The family sits around the fire and eats together, and for a while the exhaustion recedes into the background, and the warmth and the food and the company produce something that is not quite comfort in the modern sense, but is the recognizable medieval equivalent: sufficiency, presence, the particular satisfaction of a day's work ending in this specific warm room with these specific people and this specific food. It is enough. Most nights, it is enough. The nights when it is not enough are the nights you do not talk about. The nights at the end of a hard winter when the bread is thin and the pottage is mostly water and the children are quieter than usual, and you and your wife look at each other across the fire with the particular look of people who are thinking the same thing and have decided not to say it out loud because saying it would not help, and the morning is coming and there is work to do. Sunday comes once a week, and it is the only day you do not work the fields. This is not a gift. It is a commandment, the third commandment, the one about keeping the Sabbath holy, which in the medieval Catholic world means Sunday, the Lord's Day, the day of rest that is simultaneously a day of obligation. You are required to attend Mass, not invited, not encouraged, required by canon law and by the social pressure of a community in which your absence from the church on Sunday morning would be noticed by everyone and commented on by some and reported to the priest by at least one person who considers it their duty to maintain the standards of the parish. You go to Mass because you believe, and you believe because the world you were born into makes belief as natural and as unquestioned as breathing, and also because not going has social consequences that you prefer to avoid. The church is the best building in the village. This is almost always true in medieval France. The church is where the community's collective resources and collective aspirations found their most durable expression. The stone building that would outlast any individual and many generations. The place that connected this specific village to the universal body of the church, and through the church to God, and through God to the entire structure of, meaning that made the world comprehensible. The church in your village is not large, a single nave, a small chancel, a bell tower that is the tallest structure for several kilometers in any direction. But it is solid, and it is old, and its walls are painted inside with images that tell the stories that the congregation needs to know. Because the congregation cannot read, and the images are the text. The paintings are important. On the north wall, the Last Judgment, Christ in glory at the center, the saved rising to his right hand, and the damned descending to his left into a hell rendered with a specificity and an inventiveness that suggests the painter had thought carefully about the subject. The damned are recognizable types: the miser with his money bags, the glutton surrounded by food he can no longer eat, the proud man prostrating himself before a devil who is not impressed. The saved are less individual, more generic, arranged in the orderly rows of those who have followed the rules and are now receiving their reward. The painting is not subtle. It is not trying to be subtle. It is trying to communicate to a largely illiterate congregation the consequences of the choices they make in the short time they have on earth, and it communicates with the directness of a message that cannot afford to be misunderstood. Father Bertrand says Mass in Latin. The Mass is the Tridentine rite, or rather the pre-Tridentine rite, the medieval Mass that will eventually be standardized at the Council of Trent, but that currently exists in regional variations, each diocese having its own customs and its own calendar of saints. The universal structure of the Mass providing continuity, while the local variations provide identity. The priest faces east, toward the altar, away from the congregation. His back to the nave throughout most of the service. He speaks in a low voice for much of it, the sacred words not projected to the congregation, but murmured toward the altar, toward God, the congregation present as witnesses rather than participants. You understand perhaps one word in 10. The Latin of the Mass is not the Latin of the classical authors. It is the Latin of Jerome's Vulgate Bible and of the early Church Fathers and of the liturgical tradition, a sacred language that has been preserved specifically because it is not the language of daily life, because its foreignness is part of its power, because the sacred should not sound like the ordinary. The words you know, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, the response that the congregation makes at the appropriate moments, you know not by understanding them, but by having heard them every week of your life, the sounds embedded in the body rather than the mind, available without thought like the words of a song. What you participate in, actively, is less the verbal content of the Mass than its physical and ritual structure. You stand for the gospel and kneel for the consecration. The moment when the priest elevates the host and the bell rings and the bread becomes. In the theology that structures your entire understanding of the universe, the body of Christ. This is not a metaphor for you. It is not a symbol. The transformation that the priest performs at the altar is understood as real, as literal, as the most significant event that occurs in this village on any given Sunday. More significant than the harvest, more significant than any birth or death, because it is the intersection of the temporal and the eternal, the point where God enters the world through the hands of an unremarkable middle-aged man in a village nobody has heard of in the south of France. The saints matter enormously, not as abstract figures of veneration, but as active presences, as intercessors with God, on behalf of specific petitions from specific people who have addressed them correctly. The saint of the parish church, your church is dedicated to Saint Bartholomew, the apostle martyred by being flayed alive, a detail that the painting on the east wall renders with the straightforward descriptiveness of medieval sacred art, is the primary intercessor for the village, the heavenly patron, whose feast day is celebrated with more ceremony than any other, whose image above the altar is the fixed point of the sacred geography of this community. But there are other saints for other needs: Saint Roch for plague, Saint Anthony for skin diseases, Saint Blaise for throat ailments, the Virgin for everything that the other saints cannot handle. Which is most things. The Virgin is central in a way that formal theology sometimes struggled to accommodate, but that popular practice made unavoidable. She is closer than God, not in the theological sense, but in the practical sense, in the sense that she can be approached with the specific and embarrassing requests that one hesitates to bring directly to the divine. The prayers addressed to her in the privacy of the cottage or in the moment before sleep are not the formal prayers of the liturgy, but conversations. The specific language of someone speaking to a woman who has known suffering and who might therefore understand what it is like to be cold and hungry and frightened and not sure what is coming. The sermon, when Father Bertrand delivers one, is in the vernacular, in the Occitan dialect of the Languedoc, the language you actually speak, the language in which daily life is conducted. The sermon is not a theological lecture. Father Bertrand's theological education is limited. He knows the basics, the articles of faith, the 7 sacraments, the 7 deadly sins, the commandments, and his sermons draw on this foundation with the directness of a man who knows his congregation and knows that complexity will not serve them. The sins are concrete and recognizable. The pride that makes you think you are better than your neighbor. The envy that poisons your relationship with the family in the house at the end of the street, whose harvest was better than yours this year. The sloth that makes you skip mass on a cold morning when the bed is warm. The virtues are equally concrete. The charity that means giving what you can to those who have less. The humility that means accepting your station without resentment. The faith that means trusting in God's plan even when God's plan is difficult to distinguish from simple misfortune. You confess once a year at Easter, which is the canonical minimum. The confession is not the general acknowledgement of sinfulness that a modern person might imagine, but a specific inventory, a list of specific sins committed since the last confession, examined according to the categories that the Church provides. Father Bertrand hears your confession in the church, in a corner of the nave, not yet in the enclosed confessional booth that will become standard in later centuries, but in a semi-public setting that provides limited privacy. You tell him what you have done that you should not have done. The anger at your neighbor over the boundary dispute that went on too long. The Sunday morning 2 months ago when you did not come to Mass because the weather was bad, and you told yourself it was because of the weather, but you knew it was because you did not feel like it. The envy that flared when you saw Guichard's harvest and knew it was larger than yours, though his land is no better. Father Bertrand listens, assigns a penance, 3 paternosters, and 3 Ave Marias, said on 3 successive mornings, and absolves you. The relief of this is real. Not in the psychological sense that a modern person might understand. Not the relief of having spoken difficult things to another person and been heard. The relief is theological, and it is experienced as such. The relief of a quantifiable debt having been settled, of an account that was in arrears having been brought back to 0. Sin accumulates. Unconfessed sin accumulates in ways that have real consequences, not in this life, but in the next, in the time in purgatory that must be served before the soul can proceed to heaven, a time that can be shortened by the correct performance of the correct spiritual obligations. The whole apparatus of sin and confession and penance and indulgence is not superstition for you. It is a system, a way of managing the moral dimension of existence with the same practical attention that you bring to managing the grain store or the Corvée obligation, a set of real debts and real payments in a currency that is not money, but is not less real for that. Purgatory is where most people go. Heaven, in the popular understanding of the theology, is for the saints and the very holy, for people who have lived lives of exceptional virtue, which is not a description that applies to you or to anyone you know well. Hell is for the very wicked, the people who have died in unconfessed mortal sin, the category of the utterly lost. Purgatory is for everyone else, the vast middle ground of people who were basically trying, but not always succeeding, who sinned and confessed and sinned again, and died with some residual debt outstanding, who need time, measured not in years, but in units of spiritual obligation, to be purified before they can enter the presence of God. The prayers of the living can shorten this time. Masses said for the dead, indulgences purchased on behalf of the dead, the spiritual merits accumulated by the living and applied to the account of the dead. These are not merely comforting fictions. They are mechanisms described and certified by the Church for managing the relationship between the living and the dead across the boundary of death. You pray for your parents. Your father died 6 years ago, and your mother 3 years ago. And both of them are somewhere in the system, past the judgment, in the process of purification, at a distance that prayer can still reach. This is not a metaphor. It is the actual situation as you understand it, as Father Bertrand has explained it, as the painting on the north wall confirms. The dead are not gone. They are elsewhere, in a state that is temporary, and that your prayers can influence. The relationship between you and your parents did not end when they died. It changed in character and became more difficult to navigate, but it continues. And the prayers you say for them every evening before sleep are not sentiment, but obligation. The continuation of a relationship that death has not terminated. The bells ring for the end of Mass. The congregation files out into the Sunday morning. The brief freedom of a day without fieldwork opening before them like a door into a slightly larger room. There are things to do that are not fieldwork. The mending, the washing when the weather permits, the maintenance of the house and the tools, the visiting of neighbors, the arguments that have been postponed from the working week because there was no time for them. Sunday is not leisure in the modern sense. It is a different kind of work, the work of being a community rather than a laborer, the social maintenance that requires its own time and attention. But first, for a few minutes, in the weak autumn sunlight outside the church, there is something that is almost rest. There is a word going around the village. Not a word exactly, more of a sound, a quality of silence that precedes certain conversations. The particular hesitation that appears when someone starts to say something and then decides not to finish it. You have noticed it for perhaps 2 weeks. The miller mentioned something to the blacksmith last Tuesday and stopped when he saw you coming. The widow at the end of the village has been gathering more of a particular herb than usual. You do not know what it is, but you have seen her stripping the dried leaves from the stems with the focused attention of someone preparing for something specific. Father Bertrand said something in the sermon last Sunday about the mercy of God in times of trial that seemed to have a weight to it beyond the usual weight of such phrases. The word, when it finally arrives, comes from a merchant. He passes through on a Thursday, a traveling cloth merchant from Montpellier heading north, stopping for a night at the tavern. And by the next morning, everyone in the village knows what he said, because information travels in a village the way water travels in soil, immediately, completely, through every available channel simultaneously. What he said is this, that in Marseille, in October, ships arrived from the east carrying sailors who were already dying, and that the dying spread from the sailors to the port and from the port to the city, and that in Marseille now there are so many dead that the living cannot bury them fast enough, and that the disease, if it is a disease, if it is not something else, something worse, moves from person to person with a speed and a thoroughness that no one who has seen it can explain. You have heard of plague before. The word exists in your language and in the Bible, and in the history that Father Bertrand occasionally references in his sermons. the plagues of Egypt, the pestilences that God visited on the Israelites when they sinned, the great plague of Justinian that devastated the Mediterranean world 8 centuries ago, and that exists in folk memory as a category of disaster rather than a specific event. Plague is something that happens. It is one of the things, along with famine and war, that the medieval mind understood as the instruments of divine judgment, the mechanisms by which God corrected a world that had gone wrong. The question that the merchant's news immediately raises in every mind in the village is not a medical question. It is a theological one. What has been done to deserve this, and what can be done to address it? The symptoms the merchant described are specific enough to be memorable. A swelling in the groin or the armpit, the size of an egg or larger, painful to the touch. Fever, blackening of the skin in places, which is where the name will eventually come from, though the name is not yet established. The thing not yet named in the way that named things are understood. Vomiting of blood in some cases. Death, in most cases, within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. He had seen it with his own eyes in Marseille. He had left Marseille quickly, which is why he was here, heading north, away from it. The village does what villages do when confronted with information they cannot process. It talks. For several days, the talking is constant, in the fields, around the fires, after Mass, in the small clusters of people who form and dissolve throughout the day, with the specific purposefulness of people who are frightened and do not know what to do about it. The talking is not analysis, exactly. It does not produce conclusions or action plans. It is the processing of fear through the available channels, the communal working through of something that has no precedent in living memory, and that the usual frameworks do not quite fit. Father Bertrand calls a special Mass. It is a votive Mass, a Mass for a specific intention, in this case, for the protection of the village from the pestilence that is reportedly moving north. He says it on a Wednesday evening, the church full in a way it rarely is on a weekday. The faces of the congregation in the candlelight showing the particular expression of people who are frightened and who have come to the one place where fear is acknowledged and addressed in an organized way. The Mass is for Saint Roch, the patron of plague victims, and for the Virgin, and the prayers are specific and urgent and sincere in the way that prayers are sincere when the person praying is genuinely afraid. You are afraid. This is worth acknowledging directly, without the softening that the vocabulary of faith provides. The faith is real, and the prayer is real, and the trust in God's providence is real, and underneath all of it, unmediated and physical, is the fear that a body feels when it understands that something is coming that it cannot outrun or outwork or reason its way past. You have buried 4 people in the last 3 years. Your mother, an infant who did not survive the first winter, a young man killed in a field accident, an old woman who simply stopped waking up one morning. Death is not abstract here. It is familiar and specific, and it takes people you know. And what is coming from the south is death on a scale that the merchant's description makes almost impossible to imagine. Death that does not wait for the old and the weak, but takes the young and the strong indiscriminately. Death that moves faster than a man on horseback. The widow at the end of the village has opinions. She is the closest thing the village has to a medical authority, which is to say she is a woman who has been paying attention to illness and its treatment for 30 years, and who has developed views about what works and what does not that are based on observation rather than theory. Her views on the pestilence are not reassuring. She does not know what it is. She has heard descriptions of similar things in other places at other times. There are accounts in the village memory of a bad sickness 2 generations ago that killed several people quickly, but nothing like what the merchant described. She is preparing remedies. The herb she has been gathering is wormwood, which has properties she believes are relevant, combined with other things whose names you do not catch, but she says them with the hesitation of a person who is not confident that what she knows is adequate to what is coming. The theory of disease that the educated world operates on in 1347 is the miasma theory. The idea that disease is caused by bad air, by the emanations of rotting matter and standing water and corrupted environments, breathed in by people who are then made ill by the corruption entering the body. This theory has some practical consequences that are not entirely unhelpful. The association of disease with bad smells means that medieval people sometimes avoid genuinely disease-causing conditions like contaminated water and rotting food, not because they understand germ theory, but because germ-laden environments often do smell bad. But it also produces responses that are not helpful. Burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, carrying pomanders of spices to protect against the miasma, avoiding the cold and the night air, because these were thought to open the pores and allow the corruption in. What nobody in the village knows, what nobody in Europe knows, what nobody in the world knows in the autumn of 1347 is the actual mechanism, the bacterium, the flea, the rat, the chain of transmission that connects a port in Central Asia to a ship in Genoa, to a dock worker in Marseille, to a merchant on a road in southern France, to a village in the Languedoc. The knowledge that would allow any of this to be interrupted does not exist. The thing that is coming is not coming because of sin, or because of bad air, or because of any failure of human will or intelligence. It is coming because of a microorganism so small that it will not be seen for another 500 years, moving through a population with no immunity in a world with no understanding of what immunity means. The merchant moves on northward the next morning. He takes whatever he is carrying with him, in his blood, or on his fleas, or on the clothes he slept in, northward toward the next village, and the next town, and the next cluster of people who have not yet heard the word. The village watches him go. Then it turns back to its fields, because the fields do not wait, and the autumn ploughing is not finished, and the winter wheat must be in the ground before the first hard frost. And whatever is coming from the south is not here yet. And the work is here now, and the work is what there is. You have seen Gautier de Montbrun perhaps 12 times in your life. This is not an unusual number. The lord of a small rural estate in 14th century France is not an absent landlord in the modern sense. He is present on his land, living in the manor house at the edge of the village, eating food grown in these fields, dependent on the labor of these people for everything he has. But present does not mean accessible. The distance between the manor house and the village is not measured in meters, but in the entire vertical structure of the medieval world, a distance maintained by custom and law, and the quiet but comprehensive violence that enforces both. You do not go to the manor house unless summoned. You do not speak to the Lord unless spoken to. When he rides through the village, which he does occasionally, to inspect the fields, or to receive the rent in person, or simply because it is his land and he can, you stop what you are doing and acknowledge him, and he rides past. He is perhaps 45 years old. You know this not because anyone told you, but because you can estimate it from his face, from the grey in his beard and the set of his shoulders, from the specific quality of middle-aged authority that powerful men carry in their bodies. He is not large, not physically imposing in the way that the romances describe knights. The romances, which you have never read and never will read, but which exist in the oral tradition in garbled form, describing a world of chivalric combat and courtly love that has as much relationship to the actual lives of actual knights as the illuminated manuscripts have to the actual work of actual peasants. He is compact and watchful, and he moves on horseback with the ease of someone who has been doing it since childhood, which he has. What does he want from you? The answer is precise and innumerable, which is one of the things that makes the feudal relationship, for all its injustice, more comprehensible than it might appear. He wants the corvée, the 2 days per week of labor on the demesne, increasing to 4 days during harvest. He wants the cens, the annual rent, paid in money, a fixed sum established by the custom of the manor and theoretically unchangeable, though in practice the interpretation of custom is always contested. He wants the champart, a portion of the harvest, perhaps 1 sheaf in 12, taken from your strips before you take your own share. He wants the banalets, the fees for using the mill and the oven and the wine press. He wants the tallage, an occasional tax levied at his discretion when he needs money, which is more often than you would prefer. He wants the heriot. When you die, your best animal goes to the Lord, a death tax that can leave a family suddenly without its most important productive resource. He wants, In aggregate, perhaps a third to a half of everything you produce. This is the number that the history books give when they summarize the extraction rate of the feudal system, and it is the right order of magnitude, though the actual proportion varies by year and by circumstance and by the specific terms of the specific manner and the specific negotiation between the specific lord and the specific community. In a bad year, when the harvest is poor and the cens and the champart and the tallage are still owed in full, the proportion can be higher. In a very bad year, it can be everything and still not be enough, and the difference goes onto a debt that accumulates with interest that is paid not in money but in additional labor and additional obligation. What do you get from him? This question is less often asked, but it has an answer. You get the right to farm his land, which is the foundation of your existence in a world where land is the only source of food and the only source of income and the only security available. You get protection, theoretical, imperfect, inconsistent, but real, from the violence of other lords and other bands of armed men. Protection that takes the form of the walls of the manor house and the armed men who serve the Lord, and who can, in principle, be deployed to defend the village against threats that the village cannot defend itself against. You get access to the mill and the oven and the wine press, the collective infrastructure of agricultural production that no individual family could maintain independently. You get the justice of the manorial court, which is the Lord's court, which is not impartial, but which is better than no court at all, in a world where disputes unresolved by authority are resolved by violence. The manorial court meets several times a year in the great hall of the manor house, presided over by the Lord's steward, a man named Guillaume, literate, cold-eyed, who keeps the records of the manor in a hand so precise and so small that you wonder sometimes what it would be like to be able to write things down. And it handles the disputes and the infractions and the obligations of the village with an efficiency that serves the Lord's interests first, and the village's interests where they happen to coincide with the Lord's. Boundary disputes between neighbors, accusations of theft, the inheritance of land when a tenant dies without a clear heir, the assessment of fines for violations of the forest rights and the fishing rights and the gleaning rights that are all, in their various ways, the Lord's rights first, and the community's rights by permission. You have appeared before the court twice, once for a boundary dispute with the neighbor to your east, a man named Bertoul, whose strip abuts yours along a line that both of you believe runs in your own favor. The court found for Bertoul, which you believe was wrong, and which you have continued to believe was wrong for 3 years, and which you will continue to believe was wrong for the rest of your life, because the belief is not separable from the memory, and the memory does not fade. The second time was when your father died, and you formally took over the tenancy of his strips paying the entry fine that the custom of the manor requires, a sum that represented most of what the family had saved over the previous 2 years, and that was paid without complaint, because the alternative was losing the tenancy entirely. The Lord has obligations too. This is the theoretical foundation of the feudal contract, not a contract in the legal sense, not a written agreement between parties of equal standing, but a set of customary expectations that both parties understand, and that the community enforces through the pressure of its own memory and its own sense of what is right. The Lord is supposed to protect his peasants. He is supposed to maintain the infrastructure of the manor, the mill, the roads, the drainage ditches that keep the fields from flooding. He is supposed to exercise his justice fairly, or at least consistently. He is supposed to moderate his demands during years of poor harvest, to not take the champart at the full rate when there is barely enough harvest to keep the village alive. These obligations are not always honored, but they are not entirely ignored either, because a lord who consistently violates the expectations of his tenants loses something, not their legal recourse, which is limited, but their cooperation, which is not. The relationship between lord and peasant, when it works, is not so much a relationship of domination as a relationship of mutual extraction operating within limits that both parties understand and neither party is entirely satisfied with. The lord extracts labor and rent and fees. The peasants extract, in return, the security and infrastructure and justice, imperfect, partial, biased, that they cannot provide for themselves. The limits are set by custom, which is the medieval word for the accumulated precedent of generations of negotiation between people who were not equal, but who were not either entirely without power over each other. A village that worked slowly and badly and lost tools and let animals onto the Lord's crops and generally made itself difficult to manage was a village that a prudent lord learned to handle with some care. There is a rent day coming. In the next 2 weeks, the cens for the year must be paid. The fixed money rent that is theoretically immutable, but that must nonetheless be assembled, coin by coin. From the proceeds of whatever surplus the harvest has produced, and whatever cash work you have done for wages, and whatever small economies your wife has managed through the year. The sum is not large in absolute terms, a few sous, a fraction of a livre, but in the context of a household economy that operates almost entirely on the edge of sufficiency. It represents a significant concentration of cash that has been accumulated specifically for this purpose and cannot be spent on anything else. The payment will be made to Guillaume the steward, who will enter it in his book in that precise small hand, and the tenancy will be secure for another year. You think about the Lord sometimes in the way that you think about the weather, as a force that shapes the conditions of your life without being amenable to argument or appeal. Something to be read and anticipated and worked around rather than confronted. He is not a villain. He is not a hero. He is the man who owns the land you farm, who takes a third of what you produce, who will take your best animal when you die, who provides in return a set of services and protections that are worth something, though not as much as a third of everything you produce. This assessment is not rebellious. It is simply accurate. The world has lords in it. You were born into a world with this lord in it, in this village, on this land. The question is not whether the arrangement is just. It is not, and everyone knows it, but whether it can be managed, and how, and what room there is within it for a life that is more than mere survival. Most years there is a little room. The family eats, the children grow, the strips are farmed, the rent is paid, the pig is slaughtered in November, and the salt pork lasts until March, and the garden produces, and the goats give milk, and the bread is dark and dense, and there is enough of it. The Lord rides through occasionally on his horse, and you stop and acknowledge him, and he rides past, and the village continues. It is a life. It is the life that most human beings who have ever lived have lived, in one form or another, under one lord or another, in one village or another, from the beginning of agriculture to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a span of roughly 10,000 years, a vast majority of all the human lives ever lived. It is not the life that the history books describe, because history books are written about the people who owned the horses, but it is the life that made everything else possible, that fed the cities and the armies and the cathedrals and the universities and the whole superstructure of what we call civilization, built on a foundation of dark bread and corv labor and the annual payment of the cens to a man on a horse who does not know your name. The light is gone by the time you reach the house, not fading, gone, the way light goes in late autumn at this latitude, dropping below the horizon with a speed that always seems slightly faster than you expected, the grey afternoon becoming grey dusk, becoming dark within the space of an hour that you were not paying attention to because you were still in the field, and the field required attention. You have been working since before dawn. You have ploughed and carried and bent and lifted and warped and bent again, and the body knows the accounting of it in the way that bodies keep accounts, in the specific weight of tired that lives in the lower back and the shoulders and the hands, the accumulated cost of a day of physical labor that will be paid tonight in sleep and incompletely recovered by morning. The village at dusk has a particular quality. The fires are being built up inside the houses. You can see the smoke thickening from the chimneys and the thatch, the smell of wood smoke intensifying as the temperature drops and the village draws inward. The outdoor life of the daylight hours contracting into the indoor life of the evening. Children are being called in. Animals are being settled. The sounds of the day, the sounds of work, of movement, of people in the fields and the yard, are being replaced by the sounds of the household, the domestic sounds of cooking and settling, and the low conversation of people in small spaces. Your wife has the fire high and the pottage on, and the table, a board on trestles, nothing more, but a surface to eat from, set with the wooden bowls and the spoons that are the extent of your household's eating equipment. There are no forks. Forks are a luxury of the Italian urban classes, an affectation that has not yet reached the tables of the rural French, and would not be considered useful here anyway, since what you eat with a fork in a world of bread and pottage is not immediately obvious. You eat with the spoon and with the bread. The bread serving as both food and utensil, the thick crust used to scoop what the spoon cannot efficiently manage, the whole thing consumed without ceremony, in the direct way of people who are hungry and have been waiting for this moment since the midday bread. The children are already at the table. The oldest, your son, 12 years old, who has been in the field with you since mid-morning, is as tired as you are, the same specific tired in the same specific places, his body learning the accounting system that yours has been running for 20 years. The younger two have been with their mother and their grandmother, doing the indoor work of the day, the spinning, the mending, the feeding of the animals, the fetching of water from the well, the dozen tasks that constitute the management of a household. They are not tired in the same way, but they are tired. The particular tiredness of children who have been active all day in the cold and who are now in the warm and have eaten and are approaching the end of their available energy. Your wife's mother sits closest to the fire. She is always closest to the fire now, the cold having become her primary adversary in a way it was not when she was younger, her body producing less heat than it once did and requiring more of it from outside. She eats slowly and carefully, the teeth that remain giving her some difficulty with the harder bread, and she talks while she eats in the way of old people who have things they want to say and have learned not to wait for an invitation. Tonight she is talking about the pestilence, not with fear exactly, or not primarily with fear, but with the particular quality of attention that she brings to anything that threatens the household. The same quality she brings to a late frost or a sick animal or a dispute with the neighbor. She remembers something. This is the value of old people in a world without books. They remember things that happen before anyone else's memory begins, things that have no other repository. What she remembers is a sickness 40 years ago, when she was a young woman, that came through 2 villages to the south and killed several people quickly. She does not know what it was. She does not know if it was the same thing that is coming from Marseille now. But she remembers that the people who seemed to fare best were the ones who stayed away from the sick, not out of cowardice, but out of a practical instinct that she describes in terms of not breathing the same air, not touching the same objects. She does not know why this worked. She knows that it seemed to. The evening, for all its tiredness, has a texture that the daytime does not. The daytime is defined by work and its demands, by the external schedule of the Corvée and the field and the light. The evening is smaller and more internal, the space of the household rather than the space of the village and the fields, the time when the family exists as a unit rather than as a collection of individuals dispersed across different tasks. You talk, not about large things, not usually. The conversation of an evening is the conversation of people who have been apart all day and are now together again. The exchange of small information, what happened, what was seen, what needs to be done tomorrow. Your son tells you about a fox he saw at the edge of the north field. Your wife tells you that the younger goat has been off her feed for 2 days and that she is worried. Your wife's mother continues her assessment of the pestilence with the calm thoroughness of someone who considers this a practical problem requiring practical consideration. After the meal, the spinning. Your wife spins every evening, without exception. The distaff and spindle, producing the thread that is eventually woven into the cloth, that is eventually made into the clothing that everyone in the household wears. The spinning is not a hobby, it is a necessity, a continuous production task without which the household would eventually run out of functional clothing, which in this climate and at this level of poverty would be a serious problem. She spins by firelight, which is adequate for the purpose if you know how to position yourself relative to the light, which she does, having been doing this since she was old enough to be taught. Your wife's mother sometimes spins too, her hands still capable of the motion, even when the rest of her moves slowly. Your daughter, 8 years old, is learning. Her thread is uneven, and she loses the tension and has to start again. But she is learning, the skill entering her hands through practice, the way all skills enter in this world. You mend a piece of harness, the leather strap that broke this afternoon, the one that held the ox's collar in place, and that you tied in a temporary knot to get through the rest of the day's work. This needs to be properly repaired before tomorrow, because temporary solutions become permanent problems in the way of things not attended to, and you cannot afford a broken harness at this point in the ploughing season. You work by firelight too, the awl and the thread and the leather, requiring concentration, but not the kind of concentration that excludes other things. So you are mending and listening to your wife's mother, and occasionally contributing to the conversation, and watching the fire in the unfocused way of someone whose body is tired, but whose mind is still running. The children fall asleep where they are. This is normal. The youngest simply stops participating in the conversation and tips sideways against his sister, who shifts to accommodate him without waking, and is herself asleep within minutes. Your wife moves them to the sleeping area, with the practiced ease of someone who does this most nights, rearranging the household for sleep without disturbing anything that does not need to be disturbed. Your son stays awake longer, the tiredness in him real, but not yet quite sufficient to close his eyes, and he sits by the fire in the particular way of 12-year-olds who are too old to fall asleep in the middle of the room, but not yet old enough to manage their own sleep with adult efficiency. The fire is the center of all of this, not just as a heat source, though the heat is essential, the room without the fire dropping to temperatures that are genuinely dangerous in the coldest months. But as the organizing principle of the evening, the thing that determines where everyone sits and how the light falls, and what is possible in the time that remains after the day's work is done. Every family in the village is gathered around a fire like this one right now, in rooms like this one, doing things like this, the spinning and the mending and the conversation and the slow slide towards sleep. This is the texture of the medieval evening, the hours between the end of work and the beginning of sleep, 2 or 3 hours at most, the brief time in which the household is itself, rather than a unit of production. Your wife's mother says goodnight and settles herself near the fire with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to make the settling as comfortable as possible. Your son finally gives in to the tiredness and goes to his place without being told. Your wife finishes the thread she is spinning and winds it onto the bobbin and puts the distaff away with the small, precise movements of someone who puts things away in the same place every night and does not need to think about where that place is. The fire is banked. The animals are settled. The dog is at the door. Outside, the night is cold and full of rain, and in Marseille, 2 weeks' journey to the south, the dying continues and the roads north are open. The dark in a medieval village is a different kind of dark. This is not a poetic observation. It is a physical fact, measurable and significant, with consequences for how the night is experienced that modern people have almost entirely lost access to. There is no street lighting. There are no lit windows from neighboring houses. The shutters are closed against the cold, and the light inside is too faint to project through wood and thatch. There is no glow on the horizon from a nearby town. On a cloudy night, which this is, there is no moonlight and no starlight. The darkness outside the house is total, in a way that most people alive today have never experienced and cannot quite imagine. Not the manageable darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, not the semi-darkness of a city street at 3 a.m, but the absolute darkness of a world without electricity. A darkness in which your eyes, given any amount of time to adjust, simply cannot find anything to adjust to. Inside the house, the fire gives light. Not much. The banked fire of the sleeping hours produces more heat than illumination. the coals glowing red and orange under their covering of ash, the light they cast not reaching the far corners of the room. But it is something. The shapes of the people sleeping, the outline of the table, the gleam of the iron pot hanging over the coals. These are visible in the firelight in a way that the world outside is not. The medieval peasant sleeps in a dim, warm cave of firelight surrounded by absolute darkness. And this is simply the way night is, the way it has always been, the way it will be for several more centuries until someone works out how to produce cheap artificial light at scale. You lie down in your place and the darkness presses in, and the sounds of the night begin. The sounds of the medieval night are not silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and what the night outside contains is not the absence of sound, but a different register of sound, lower, slower, further apart than the sounds of the day, the sounds of a world in which most of the things that make noise are also sleeping, but not all of them. The owls are awake. There are 2 of them in the vicinity of the village, their calls carrying across the fields with a clarity that the daytime sounds never achieve. The soft, repetitive calls marking their territory or communicating with each other in whatever way owls communicate. The dogs are awake or intermittently awake. You can hear the dog 2 houses down responding to something. A short burst of barking and then silence, and your own dog lifting his head at the door and then settling again. The rain has stopped. The dripping from the thatch continues for a while, irregular, and then less frequent, and then occasional. The sound of the roof finishing what the rain started. In the distance, further than you can identify precisely, there is the sound of the river, audible tonight in the particular way that rivers are audible after heavy rain, a fuller sound than usual, the water carrying more of itself than it normally does. You know this sound. You have been hearing it your entire life. And it tells you things, that the ford will be higher tomorrow, that the low field near the bend might have water on it in the morning, that this is not the night to cross with a loaded cart, even if you needed to. The cold comes. This is the thing about the medieval night that no description quite prepares you for, not the darkness, which you know, but the cold, which is different from the daytime cold in its quality as well as its degree. The daytime cold is something you move through, something you generate heat against through the constant motion of work. The nighttime cold is something you lie in, something that settles into the parts of you that are not covered, that finds its way through the blanket and through the clothing you have kept on, and through the warmth that the bodies around you generate, always finding the gap, always pressing in at the edges. You sleep closer to each other than any modern family would consider comfortable. This is not a cultural difference about personal space. It is thermodynamics. The collective body heat of several people sharing a sleeping area is meaningfully warmer than any individual sleeping alone, and in a room that will drop below 10 degrees before dawn, the difference between sleeping close together and sleeping alone is the difference between cold and dangerously cold. The children are in the middle, where it is warmest. The adults are at the edges, where they are slightly colder, but where they provide a windbreak of human warmth for the smaller bodies they surround. There are things in the dark that you do not think about directly, but that are present in the background of the night, the way the river sound is present, not focused upon but not absent either, part of the texture of being awake in the dark. The wolves. There are wolves in the forest to the north. Not many, not as many as there were 2 generations ago when the forest was larger, but enough to take a sheep or a goat if the opportunity presents itself, enough to make the livestock in the house something other than merely an inconvenience. The dog knows about the wolves in the way dogs know things, through some combination of smell and sound that operates at a range the human senses cannot match. And his nighttime alertness is partly about this, the guardian function that dogs and humans have been co-performing for longer than anyone's memory goes. There are other things too. The medieval night is populated in ways that the modern night is not. Not just by animals, but by the beings that inhabit the space between the visible and the invisible. The entities that the church has categories for, and that the popular tradition has others for, categories that do not always agree. The church says the night is the time of the devil's activity, the hours when evil is strongest, and the protection of prayer and the cross is most needed. The popular tradition is more specific and more local. There are particular places in the landscape that are understood to be inhabited or frequented by particular presences. A crossroads a kilometer to the east where things have been heard at night. A pool in the forest where the water is wrong somehow. Cold even in summer. The surface too still. You do not go to these places at night. This is not superstition in the dismissive sense of the word. It is the practical navigation of a world that is genuinely less understood than it appears, where the causes of things are not always available to inspection, and where the accumulated wisdom of the community about what to avoid is a form of knowledge that deserves respect, even when its foundations are not entirely clear. The fear of the dark is old, older than your village, older than France, older than Christianity, a mammalian inheritance from the long period before fire, when the dark was genuinely dangerous, and the things in it could eat you. The fire manages this fear in the same way it has always managed it, by making a boundary, defining the space of safety, holding the dark at a specific distance. You have been sleeping by firelight your entire life, and the fear of the dark is not acute, not a thing that keeps you awake, but it is present as a background condition of the night, a low-level awareness that the darkness outside the fire's reach is different from the darkness inside it. You dream. The dreams of an exhausted person are often deep and total, the mind dropping quickly into the sleep stages where dreams occur, and staying there, the body's need for restoration overriding the lighter, more intermittent sleep that anxiety produces. Tonight you dream about the field, not about plowing it, not about the work, but about the field itself, the specific piece of earth that you farm, the particular texture and color of its soil that you know as well as you know the faces of your children. And in the dream, the field is larger than it is, extending in all directions past its actual boundaries. And you are walking across it in the specific way of dream walking that covers distance without effort. And the soil is good soil, dark and rich. The kind of soil that produces without being asked. Sometime in the deepest part of the night the baby stirs. Not your baby, your youngest is 5, past the age of waking in the night for feeding. This is a baby 2 houses down, the sound carrying through the walls and the thatch with the ease of sound in a quiet night. The specific cry of a young infant that adult ears are calibrated to respond to, even in sleep. It cries for a few minutes and then stops. You have not fully woken. The night continues. The dog stands up at the door. You hear this, the specific sound of a dog changing position, the claws on the earthen floor, the settling again into a different arrangement. He does not bark. Whatever he heard or smelled has satisfied or retreated. The night continues. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, the temperature reaches its lowest point. The fire is down to its most minimal, the ash insulating the coals, but the warmth it radiates at its least. This is the hour when the cold is most present, when the blanket feels thinnest, when the body's own heat production is at its overnight low. You shift closer to your wife without waking, the movement unconscious, the body managing its own thermodynamics while the mind is elsewhere. In Marseille, 2 weeks to the south, the dying does not pause for the night. The bells that ring for the dead ring through the dark hours as they ring through the daylight hours. Because the dead do not wait for morning, and the living have stopped pretending that they do. The roads north are quiet in the dark, but they are there, connecting Marseille to the next town, and the next town to the one after, and the network of roads to the villages that lie off them, including this one, including this house, including the 7 people sleeping in it, unaware that time is the only thing standing between them and what is coming, and that time is running out. But the night here is quiet. The owls call. The fire breathes. The dog sleeps at the door. The darkness outside is total and cold and full of the ordinary mystery of a medieval night in late autumn. The same night that has been happening in this village for 200 years and will happen for several hundred more. The long unrecorded dark in which most of history takes place and no one is watching, and nothing is written down. You sleep. Tomorrow is coming. It always is. You wake before the bell. The body has learned the rhythm of the days so completely that it anticipates the bell the way it anticipates hunger, not as a response to the stimulus, but as a preparation for it. The mind surfacing from sleep in the minutes before the sound, already orienting itself toward the day before the day has officially begun. The fire is low. The room is cold. Outside, the darkness is the same darkness it has been all night, absolute and pressing. But there is something in the quality of it that is different from the darkness of midnight. Not lighter, not yet, but different in the way that the hour before dawn is always different, charged with the imminence of light that has not yet arrived. You lie still for a moment. This moment, the moment between waking and rising, between sleep and the day, is perhaps the only moment in the day that belongs entirely to you. The Corvée does not reach here. The Lord's fields do not reach here. The rent and the tithe and the champart and the bannerlits do not reach here. Here there is only the warmth of the bodies around you, and the sound of breathing, and the low red light of the coals. And for a minute, 2 minutes, the duration of the moment before the bell rings and the day begins, you exist in a space that is entirely your own. Then the bell rings, and you rise. Consider what you have lived today. You woke in a cold, dark room with 2 goats and a pig and 6 other people, in a building that provides shelter but not comfort, in a body that will ache tomorrow from what it did today, and the day before, and every day before that, for as long as you have been old enough to work, which is most of your life. You spent the daylight hours in a field that is not yours, producing food that will largely go to someone else, under an obligation that you did not choose and cannot escape, in weather that did not cooperate and did not care. You came home to a meal of dark bread and thin pottage and watered wine, eaten quickly by firelight, and you mended a piece of harness and listened to your wife's mother talk about the pestilence that is coming from the south. And you said your prayers, and you lay down in the dark and slept as close as possible to the people you love, because the cold requires it. And somewhere in the south, something is moving north. The Black Death, the name it will eventually be given, though not yet, not here, not in this village where it does not yet have a name because it has not yet arrived, will reach this region within months. The historians who have studied its progress through France in the winter and spring of 1347 and 1348 trace it along the roads and the rivers, from Marseille to Avignon, and from Avignon north and west into the countryside, arriving in the towns first and then spreading to the villages, moving at the speed of human movement in a world where human movement is mostly walking. What it will do to this village cannot be said with certainty, because this village left no records and its fate is not individually documented. What it did to villages like this one, throughout France and throughout Europe, can be said with the terrible precision of demographic research. It killed, on average, between a third and a half of the population of the regions it passed through. In some places more. In some places, through some combination of isolation and luck, and decisions we can sometimes trace and sometimes cannot. Less. The village you have spent this day in had perhaps 200 people in it this morning. A year from now, it may have 100, or 80, or 60. The people who will die are not the old and the weak only, as modern people sometimes assume. Mapping the pattern of familiar diseases onto an unfamiliar one. The Black Death killed the young and the strong, and the healthy with a thoroughness that distinguished it from everything that had come before, that made it different in kind from the normal mortality of medieval life. It killed priests who came to administer last rites, and physicians who came to examine patients, and family members who came to tend the sick, and neighbors who came to help. It killed in the spring, when people were at their most active, and in the summer when the harvest was waiting, and in the autumn when the salt pork should have been going into the barrels and the grain into the sacks. What happened to the survivors is harder to describe than what happened to the dead, and perhaps more important. The Europe that emerged from the Black Death was not the Europe that entered it. The labor shortage created by the death of a third of the agricultural workforce transformed the economic relationship between lords and peasants in ways that centuries of legal theory and social custom had not. Suddenly there was more land than there were people to work it, and the people who remained could demand better terms, and the lords who refused found their fields unworked and their rents uncollected. The peasant revolts of the second half of the 14th century, the Jacquerie in France, the peasants' revolt in England, were not caused by the plague alone, but they were enabled by the shift in leverage that the plague produced. The sudden discovery by the people at the bottom of the hierarchy that they were, in some irreducible sense, necessary, the Church, which had promised that prayer and penance would protect the faithful, and had been visibly unable to protect anyone, emerged from the plague with its authority diminished in ways that would take generations to fully manifest, but that were real from the beginning. The flagellant movements, the persecution of Jewish communities accused of poisoning wells, the proliferation of apocalyptic cults and heresies, these were the immediate symptoms of a theological crisis that the plague produced by demonstrating, with a thoroughness that was difficult to argue with, that the existing framework for understanding suffering and divine will was inadequate to what had actually happened. But that is later. That is history. The history that will be written by the survivors and their descendants. The history that will eventually find its way into books and then into the education of people who will read about the Black Death as an event, a datable catastrophe, something that happened in the past with a beginning and a middle and an end. For the people living in it, there is no end yet. There is only the morning, cold and dark, and the bell ringing, and the day beginning again. You rise. Your wife is already at the fire, blowing the coals to life the way she does every morning, the smoke beginning to rise through the thatch. The children are stirring. Your wife's mother is awake, as always, watching the room with the particular attention of someone for whom morning is a daily small victory. The goats want feeding. The pig is restless. The dog is at the door, waiting to be let out into the dark. The fields are waiting too. The autumn ploughing is not finished. The winter wheat must be in the ground before the first hard frost, and the frost could come any day now. And the work does not know that something is coming from the south, and would not care if it did. The work is what the work has always been. The ground and the seed and the season and the body that moves between them. The ancient negotiation between human effort and natural process that has been going on since the first grain was planted in the first field by the first farmer, who understood that you could put something in the ground and wait, and it would come back multiplied. You pull on your boots. The leather is cold and stiff and takes a moment to soften around the foot. You wrap your coat, a heavy woolen thing, worn smooth at the elbows, mended in 3 places, around your shoulders, and tie it at the waist. You take the bread your wife is already cutting from last night's loaf, the dark, dense muslin bread that is the foundation of everything, and you eat it standing by the fire, because there is not time to sit, and the body needs the fuel, and the day has already begun. At the door you pause for a moment. The village outside is waking. You can hear it, the sounds of other households starting their days. A dog barking somewhere, the distant complaint of a cartwheel needing grease. The sky is still dark, but the darkness has a different quality now. The first grey beginning to show at the eastern edge. The world preparing itself for another day, in the slow way that the world prepares itself, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by the earth continuing to turn. You step outside, the cold hits your face, and you breathe it in. The cold air of an autumn morning in 14th century France. The specific cold of this specific place. The air that smells of turned earth and wood smoke, and the coming of winter. Your breath clouds in front of you and disperses. The mud of the village track is frozen slightly at the surface, firm under the boots in a way it was not yesterday. And you notice this because you notice everything about the physical world you move through. Because the physical world is your entire world, the only world available to you. And you have been reading it for 35 years. And you know what the frozen mud in the morning means about the temperature, and what the temperature means about the frost. and what the frost means about how much time remains before the ploughing must be finished. You know things, not the things that are written in books which you cannot read, but the things that are written in the land and the weather and the seasons, the knowledge that has no archive except the minds of the people who hold it, and that disappears with those minds when they go. You know this field and this soil and this sky. You know your neighbors and their strengths and their failures and the history of every significant event in this village for as long as anyone's memory goes. You know how to grow food and tend animals and build a shelter and make a fire and navigate the complex social landscape of a community that must function as a unit or not function at all. You know how to pray, and you believe in what you pray to, and this belief is not a consolation for ignorance, but a genuine encounter with the dimension of existence that lies beyond what can be directly observed and managed. You are not a figure in a history book. You are not a symbol of medieval suffering or medieval resilience or the pre-modern condition. You are a person, specific and particular, with a specific body and specific knowledge and specific obligations and specific loves. Your wife, your children, the old woman by the fire, the strips of land whose soil you know better than you know your own face. You will not be remembered. Your name will not appear in any document that survives. Your life will leave no trace that historians can find and study and write about. And yet, you lived it, completely and specifically, with the full weight of a consciousness encountering the world and responding to it and making of it what could be made. And something is coming from the south. You do not know this yet, not with certainty. The word has reached you, the merchant's story, the widow's herbs, Father Bertrand's heavy sermon. But the knowing that changes everything has not arrived. You are standing in the cold of a November morning in 1347 in a village in the south of France, watching the sky begin to lighten in the east, and what you are thinking about is the field, the frost, the ploughing that must be finished, the wheat that must go into the ground. The work is there. The morning is here. The day begins. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the sounds of this village grow quiet around you. The fire and the animals, and the bell and the rain on the thatch, and the distant sound of the river. Let the cold and the dark and the smell of wood smoke and turned earth fade slowly into the particular quiet of sleep. The field will still be there in the morning. The work will still be there. The world will continue as it always does, beyond the edges of what any one life can see or know or hold. This life was small and specific and real, and it fed the world, and it is gone. Good night. Sleep well.